Hello, hello, hello! Greetings, salutations! Konnichiwa, and every other form of green across this vast, marvelous multiverse. I am Matsu Quinox. This is Horace, and welcome back, my dear, marvelous, wonderful scholars, to the study. Hello there, hello there, hello there. Hello there, Kin-chan. Congratulations on getting first. Welcome. Hello there, Yulian20. Good evening to you too, and thank you for the resubscribe. Oh my goodness. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, all you scholars, wherever you are, whenever you are across this vast, marvelous multiverse. Oh my goodness. How are you all doing, my dear scholars? I hope you're well. I hope everything's going well for you today. Oh my goodness. I have to keep myself hydrated. That's what I need to do. Oh, as for myself. Oh, hello there, Private Mark. Welcome. As for myself, well, things have been somewhat unusual. Feeling 20, just spiffy, trying to keep warm. Oh, I know the feeling it can be cold this time of year wherever you are. Um, dear, dear Virgil is sick with some kind of cosmic cold. So, Ovid's looking after him, though Virgil is a bit stubborn and keeps saying he doesn't need anything, but you know how book squids are. They can be a little bit on the stubborn side. Oh, my goodness. But otherwise, things have been alright. Just been very quiet. Trying to keep myself busy. Kintron warm would be nice. It would be nice. Yulian20, nice hot cosmic soup would help. We tried. We asked Virgil if he wanted some, and he said no. He's fine. We'll see if he keeps turning it down though later on. Otherwise, things have been okay. Went a little book shopping. Bought a little books. But I mean, this place does have every book that ever existed, across the vast plane of the Omniverse. But sometimes you want a second copy, one that you can read by yourself. Just by yourself. Problem with me in bookstores is they're like candy shops. I go in, I always end up coming out with way too many. I can't help myself. Julian20, even Julian20. What? I am shocked, Julian20. I am shocked. I am dismayed and I am shocked. Kintron, always nice to have a pocket version. Yes, always nice. Julian20, you do not talk about such things in this nice chat. This nice chat. Oh, give me 1 second, my dear scholars. Yes, you do not talk about such things, Julian20. Not here. Not now. No, 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 no. Bad Julian20. But I digress. Digress. Um, Tonight, my dear scholars, we continue our reading of Around the World in 80 days. Julian20, just bringing joy to you. Well, you all bring joy to me. You make me happy. Most of the time. Where you're not throwing puns my way or talking about things that should not be talked about here. You sometimes drive me crazy, but you bring joy to me otherwise. Again, for the most part. But where was I? Oh, yes. Tonight we are reading more of Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. We have 8 chapters left, but I think we can get through 4 more tonight. Our As we left off, Phileas Fogg is trying to get around the world in 80 days as part of a bet. He has been mistaken for a robber, though, having stolen money from the Bank of England. He did not, though. As they've gone around the world, they are being trailed by Inspector Fix, who wants to capture Phileas Fogg as a suspect. Mm. However, However, they've arrived in America and have gotten separated from Passepartout, who bravely tried and helped rescue a train from attacking natives. So that's the story so far. So, my dear scholars, what do you think? Shall we continue our reading of Around the World in 80 days and see where it takes us? Yulian 20, yes, please. All right then. Well, my dear scholars, let me adjust myself a little bit. Sit back, relax, have a hot or cold beverage, dim the lights if you wish, and let us continue our reading of Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. More water. Excuse me. Chapter 30, in which Phileas Fogg quite simply does his duty. 3 passengers, one of whom was Passepartout, had disappeared. Had they been killed in the struggle? Had they been taken prisoner by the Sioux? It was too early to tell. There was quite a large number of wounded, but it was clear that none of the injuries were fatal. One of those most seriously wounded was Colonel Proctor, who had fought courageously and been struck by a bullet in the groin. Serves him right. He was transported to the station along with other passengers who required immediate treatment for their wounds. Mrs. Aouda was safe. Phileas Fogg, who had given his all, hadn't suffered a scratch. Fix was wounded in the arm, but it wasn't serious. But Passepartout was missing, and the young woman had tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, all the passengers had got out of the train. 1 second. 1 second, my dear scholars dealing with something. There we are. Meanwhile, all the passengers had got out of the train. The wheels of the carriages were stained with blood. The mangled remains of bodies were hanging from the hubs and spokes. Oh my goodness, that is disturbing. There were long trails of red stretching across the white plain as far as the eye could see. The last of the assailants was still disappearing towards the south, towards Republican River. Julian 20, ew. Yes, I agree, ew. Mr. Fogg remained motionless, arms folded. He had a crucial decision to make. Mrs. Aouda was at his side and was looking at him without saying a word. He understood the meaning of her expression. If his servant had been taken prisoner, then should he risk everything to rescue him from the Sioux? I shall find him, dead or alive, was all he said to Mrs. Aouda. Oh, sir, Mr. Fogg, the young woman exclaimed, grasping her companion's hand, onto which her tears rolled. Alive, added Mr. Fogg, providing we don't waste any time. To make this decision, Phileas Fogg was sacrificing everything. He had just condemned himself to financial ruin. A single day's delay meant he would miss the steamer from New York. His bet was irretrievably lost. But at the thought of, "This is my duty," he had not hesitated. The captain in command of Fort Kearny was there. His soldiers, about 100 men in all, had taken up defensive positions in the event of the Sioux launching a direct attack on the station. "Officer," said Mr. Fogg to the captain, "3 passengers are missing." "Presumed dead?" asked the captain. "Dead or captured," replied Phileas Fogg. "We need to find out which is the case. Is your plan to go after the Sioux?" This is a serious business, sir," said the captain. "They may flee beyond the Arkansas River. I just can't abandon the fort I'm in charge of." "Sir," continued Phileas Fogg, "the lives of 3 men are at stake. That may be so, but can I risk the lives of 50 men to save 3? I don't know whether you can, sir, but you must. Sir, replied the captain, no one here tells me my duty. Right, said Phileas Fogg coldly. I shall go alone. You, sir, cried out Fix, who had got closer. Going after the Sioux all on your own? Do you really expect me to leave this unfortunate man to die when everyone here owes their life to him? I intend to go. Well, in that case, you won't be going alone, exclaimed the captain, overcome with emotion in spite of himself. No, you are a man of courage. I want 30 volunteers, he added, turning toward his soldiers. The whole company stepped forward to a man. All the captain had to do was take his pick from these fine fellows. 30 soldiers were selected, and a wise old sergeant put in charge. Thank you, Captain. Will you allow me to come with you? Fix asked the gentleman. You may do as you wish, sir, Phileas Fogg said to him in reply, but if you really do want to do something to help me, then you should stay with Miss Iota. In the event of something happening to me. The police inspector's face suddenly went very pale. How could he let go of this man, who he had followed so doggedly and with such persistence? How could he let him venture into the wilderness like this? Fix looked at the gentleman intently, and despite himself, for all his feelings against Fogg, and in spite of the struggle that was going on inside him, he felt uncomfortable when confronted with that calm and honest expression. I shall stay here, he said. A few moments later, Mr. Fogg shook the young woman's hand, and then, after handing her his precious travel bag, he was ready to leave with the sergeant and his small troop of men. But before leaving, he said to the soldiers, My friends, there's a reward of 1,000 pounds waiting for you if we rescue the prisoners. By then, it was a few minutes past midday. Mrs. Iota had withdrawn to a room in the station, where she proceeded to wait on her own, thinking of Phileas Fogg, and his simple but noble generosity, and his quiet strength of character. Mr. Fogg had given up his fortune, and now he was risking his life, and he had done all this without hesitation, out of a sense of duty, and without false rhetoric. Phileas Fogg was a hero in her eyes. Inspector Fix wasn't of the same opinion, and he was unable to control his inner turmoil. He walked up and down along the station platform, looking agitated. After momentarily being under the gentleman's power, he then became his old self again. Once Fogg had set off, he realized how foolish he had been to let him go. How on earth could he have agreed to be separated from this man, who he had been following around the world? His true nature reasserted itself. He blamed and criticized himself. He told himself off as if he was the head of the Metropolitan Police, reprimanding a member of his force caught out by his own naivete. What a fool I've been, he thought. His other half will have told him who I am. He's gone and won't be back. Where can I get my hands on him again now? How on earth could I have let myself be taken in like this? Me, Fix, when I've got his arrest warrant in my pocket. I really must be stupid. I would not argue with that, although for a different reason, of course. These were the thoughts going through the police inspector's mind as the hours went by, all too slowly for his liking. He didn't know what to do. At times he wanted to tell Miss Iota everything, but he realized what her reaction would be. What should he decide? He was tempted to set off across the long, snow-covered plains in pursuit of Fogg. He thought he would stand some chance of finding him. The footmarks of the detachment of soldiers were still visible in the snow, but soon their traces disappeared under a fresh fall. Fix suddenly became despondent. He felt a sort of irresistible urge to give up the whole game. In fact, the opportunity to leave the station at Kearney and continue this journey, which had brought him so many disappointments, was about to present itself. What happened was that at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as the snow fell in heavy flakes, long blasts on a whistle could be heard coming from the east. A huge shadow, preceded by a yellowish glow, was moving slowly forward, made to look even bigger by the fog that gave it a ghostly appearance. However, no train was expected yet from the east. The help requested by telegraph could not have arrived so soon, and the train from Omaha to San Francisco wasn't due to arrive until the following day. The explanation soon became clear. This locomotive that was moving forward so slowly, letting out loud blasts on the whistle, was the one that, after being uncoupled from the train, had continued to run at such a terrifying speed, taking with it the fireman and the driver, who were both unconscious. It had gone on for a few miles, but then the fire had died down because of a lack of fuel. The steam had given out, and an hour later, after gradually slowing down, the engine at last came to a halt about 20 miles beyond the station at Kearney. Both the driver and the fireman were still alive, and after being unconscious for a considerable time, they had come round. The engine was then at a standstill. When he saw that he was in the middle of nowhere and with no carriages left, the driver realized what had happened. He had no idea how the locomotive had become detached from the rest of the train, but he felt sure that the carriages that had been left behind were in trouble. The driver had no hesitation about what to do. The sensible thing was to continue in the direction of Omaha. To go back toward the train, which the Sioux might still be in the process of ransacking, was fraught with danger. Never mind this. Shovelfuls of coal and wood were heaped into the firebox, and the fire got going again. The steam pressure returned, and by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon the engine was reversing towards the station at Kearney. This was the whistling noise heard in the fog. The passengers were extremely pleased when they saw the locomotive in place again at the head of the train. They would now be able to continue their journey, which had been so rudely interrupted. When the engine arrived, Mrs. Iota came out of the station building and turned to the conductor to ask, "Are you intending to leave?" "This instant, madam." "But the prisoners, our unfortunate companions."
"I can't hold up the service," the conductor replied. "We're already 3 hours late."
"When is the next train from San Francisco due?"
"Tomorrow evening, madam."
"Tomorrow evening will be too late. You must wait."
"It's impossible, madam," answered the conductor. "If you want to leave, please get into the carriage."
"I'm not leaving," said the young woman. Fix had overheard this conversation. A few minutes earlier, when there was no means of transport available, he was determined to leave Kearney, and yet now that the train was there, ready to depart, and when all he had to do was to go back to his seat in the carriage, he was bound to the spot by an irresistible force. He was itching to get off the station platform, and yet he couldn't tear himself away from it. That inner struggle had started up again. He was overcome by anger at his own failure. He wanted to fight until the bitter end. Meanwhile, the passengers and a few of the wounded, including Colonel Proctor, who was in serious condition, got into the carriages. The overheated boiler could be heard bubbling away, and steam was escaping from the valves. The driver blew the whistle. The train set off and soon disappeared, its white smoke mingling with the swirling snow. Inspector Fix had stayed behind. Several hours went by. The weather was very bad, the cold biting. Fix was sitting motionless on a bench in the station. Anyone would have thought he was asleep. Despite the gale, Miss Aoda kept on going outside the room at her that had been placed at her disposal. She walked to the far end of the platform, trying to see through the snowstorm, seeking to pierce the fog that restricted her visibility, listening for any sound she could hear. But there was nothing. Then she would go back inside, frozen to the bone, only to come out again a few moments later, but still to no avail. Evening came. The small detachment of soldiers had not returned. Where were they at that moment? Had they managed to catch up with the Sioux? Had there been a struggle, or were the soldiers wandering around, lost in the fog? The captain in Fort Kearny was extremely worried, although he didn't want it to show. Excuse me. Night fell. The snow was not so heavy, but the cold grew more intense. The most intrepid of people could not have failed to be overawed by the sight of this immense dark emptiness. Absolute silence filled the plain. There was not a bird in the sky, nor an animal on the prowl to disturb its infinite stillness. All that night, Miss Aoda, whose mind was full of premonitions of disaster, and her heart racked with anxiety, wandered about on the edge of the prairie. Her imagination transported her far away and brought her up against 1,000 dangers. What she suffered during those long hours cannot be put into words. Well, technically you just did. I mean, you are writing this book, Vern. Fix still remained motionless in the same place, but he too was unable to sleep. At one point, someone went up to him and even said something to him, but the detective sent him away after replying to him with a shake of the head. The night passed like this. At dawn, the half-extinguished orb of the sun rose above a misty horizon. Nevertheless, visibility was about 2 miles. Phileas Fogg and the detachment of soldiers had headed south. The south was absolutely deserted. By now, it was 7 o'clock in the morning. The captain, who was extremely worried, didn't know what to do. Should he lead a second detachment to come to the aid of the first? Should he sacrifice more men with so little chance of rescuing those who had been sacrificed in the first place? But he did not hesitate for long, and after gesturing towards one of his lieutenants, he was giving him the order to lead a reconnoitering party to the south when there was a burst of gunfire. Was it a signal? The soldiers rushed out of the fort, and half a mile away they noticed a small group of men returning in good order. Mr. Fogg was leading them, and close to him was Passepartout and the 2 other passengers, who had been rescued from the clutches of the Sioux. There had been a struggle 10 miles to the south of Fort Kearny. A few moments before the detachment had arrived, Passepartout and his companions were already fighting their captors, and the Frenchman had knocked out 3 of them with his bare fists when his master and the soldiers rushed to their aid. All of them, rescuers and rescued, were greeted with shouts of joy, and Phileas Fogg handed out the promised reward to the soldiers, while Passepartout kept on saying with good reason, "Really and truly, I'm costing my master a fortune." Fix didn't say a word, but was looking at Mr. Fogg, and it would have been difficult to analyze the conflicting thoughts that were then running through his mind. As for Mrs. Aoda, she had taken the gentleman's hand and was squeezing it between her own, unable to speak. Meanwhile, Passepartout, as soon as he had arrived, had looked for the train in the station. He was expecting to find it there, ready to set off for Omaha at full speed, and he was hoping that they might still be able to make up the time lost.
The train! The train! It's gone.
And when is the next train due? Asked Phileas Fogg.
Not until this evening.
Oh, was all the impassive gentleman said in reply. A little drink. Now it's interesting in the 1950s movie version, they actually expand on the whole rescue of Passepartout. Passepartout actually doesn't do very well for himself in the rescue. He's actually kept hostage until Fogg and the others come to his rescue. As you can see, Verne chose not to actually write down exactly what had happened action-wise. I don't think he was all that interested in it, since it would have taken away from the rest of the plot. But the movie does expand on it. And adds a lot more action to the scene. Although they do, again, keep it a little stereotypical in that bit. The movie also eliminates the snowstorm. There's no snowstorm in the movie version, which which probably was for a good cause, since it's very hard to control the weather when you're filming, and they were filming on location. So any attempt to add a snowstorm to a location shoot like that probably would have looked fairly fake. Chapter 31, in which Inspector Fix takes Phileas Fogg's interests very much to heart. Phileas Fogg was 20 hours late. Passepartout, who had inadvertently been the cause of this delay, was desperate. He had definitely ruined his master. It was then that the inspector went up to Mr. Fogg and looking him straight in the eye, asked,
In all seriousness, sir, are you really in a hurry?
"I am indeed," replied Phileas Fogg.
I shall say it again, continued Fix. Do you really need to be in New York on 11th December by 9 o'clock in the evening, when the steamer for Liverpool is due to leave?
"I really do."
And if your journey hadn't been interrupted by the Sioux attack, would you have arrived in New York by the morning of the 11th?
Excuse me. "Yes, with 12 hours to spare."
Good. So you are 20 hours behind. The difference between 20 and 12 is 8. You have 8 hours to make up. Do you want to attempt it?"
"On foot?" asked Mr. Fogg.
"No. By sledge," replied Fix. "A sledge with sails. A man has offered me this means of transport."
It was the man who had spoken to the police inspector during the night, and whose offer Fix had rejected. Phileas Fogg made no reply, but after Fix had pointed out the man in question, who was walking around outside the station, the gentleman went up to him. A moment later, Phileas Fogg and the American, whose name was Mudge, went into a shed below Fort Kearny. There, Mr. Fogg was able to examine a strange-looking vehicle. It was a sort of frame built upon two long beams that were turned up at the end like the runners on a sledge, and there was room for about 5 or 6 people. A third of the way along the frame to the front stood a very tall mast, to which was attached a huge spanker sail. From this mast, which was firmly held in position by cables, stretched an iron stay, the purpose of which was to hoist a very large jib. At the rear, a sort of oar rudder enabled the contraption to be steered. It was, as can be seen from this description, a sledge, but with the rigging of a sloop. A sloop's a kind of ship, by the way. In winter on the icebound plain, when the trains are no longer running because of the snow, these vehicles travel very fast from station to station. What is more, they have an enormous expansive sail, greater even than a racing cutter, which is liable to capsize. And with the wind behind them, they glide along the surface of the prairies as fast, if not faster, than express trains. By the way, this sort of vehicle does exist. It did exist. And it was used in exactly the same way Vern talks about it here. It was used for moving along ice mostly, actually. Within a few moments, Mr. Fogg and the owner of this landcraft had struck a deal. The wind was favorable. It was blowing strongly from the west. The snow had become hard, and Mudge claimed that he could get Mr. Fogg to the station in Omaha in a few hours. From there it would be easy to get to Chicago and New York, as there are plenty of trains in various lines. It was therefore quite possible that they could make up the time lost, so there was no point in hesitating about whether or not to attempt this adventure. Because he did not want to subject Mrs. Aouda to the ordeal of an open-air journey in this cold, a situation that could only be made worse by the speed at which they would be traveling, Mr. Fogg suggested to her that she should stay behind under Passpartour's protection at Kearney Station. The trusty fellow would see about bringing her back to Europe by a better route and in more favorable circumstances. Mrs. Aouda refused to be separated from Mr. Fogg, and Passepartout felt very pleased that she was so defiant about this. In any case, he wouldn't have wanted to leave his master for anything in the world, since Fix was to remain with him. What precisely was going through the police inspector's mind at that moment would be difficult to say. Was he less convinced he was right about Fogg now that he had come back? Or did he consider him to be an extremely clever crook, who once he had completed his journey around the world would be absolutely safe in England? I really don't understand Fix's logic in all this, my dear scholars. Perhaps Fix's view of Mr. Fogg really had changed, but he was still just as determined to do his duty, and he was more impatient than anyone to do his utmost to speed up their return to England. By 8 o'clock the sledge was ready to leave. The travelers, it would be tempting to call them passengers, took their seats and huddled together under their travel rugs. The two huge sails were hoisted, and with the force of the wind behind it, the vehicle raced over the hardened snow at a rate of 40 knots. Excuse me. The distance separating Fort Kearny from Omaha is in a straight line, a beeline, as the Americans would say, 200 miles at the most. If the wind held, they would have covered this distance in 5 hours. If there were no problems, the sledge should have got to Omaha by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. What a journey it turned out to be. The travelers, huddled up against one another, were unable to speak. The cold, intensified by the speed, would have prevented the words from coming out of their mouths. The sledge glided over the surface of the plain as lightly as a vessel over the surface of the water, minus the swell. When the wind came skimming along the ground, it looked as if the sledge would be lifted into the air by its sails, huge wings with a vast span. Mudge, at the rudder, kept it going straight, and with a touch on the oar he prevented the contraption from veering to one side, which it had a tendency to do. All the sails caught the wind. The jib had been perked and was no longer shielded by the spanker. Sorry, my dear scholars. A topmast was hoisted, and a topsail, put out into the wind, added to its driving force to the other sails. It was impossible to work it out exactly, but the sledge must certainly have attained a speed of no less than 40 knots. If nothing gives way, said Mudge, we'll make it. It was in Mudge's interest to arrive within the deadline, because Mr. Fogg, in keeping with his normal practice, had given him the incentive of a hefty bonus. The prairie which the sledge was directly cutting across was as flat as the sea. It looked like an enormous frozen pond. The railroad that served this part of the territory went up from the southwest to the northwest via Grand Island, Columbus, a sizable town in Nebraska, Schuyler, Fremont, and then Omaha. It followed the right bank of the Platte River for the whole of the way. The sledge took a shorter route, going in a straight line instead of following the curve chosen by the railroad. There was no need for Mudge to fear being stopped by the Platte River at the small bend it makes before Fremont, because its waters were frozen over. The way was therefore completely free of obstacles, and so there were only two things for Phileas Fogg to be afraid of: damage to the craft, and a change of direction, or drop in the wind. But the wind did not slacken. Far from it. It blew so hard as to bend the mast, which was firmly supported by the iron cables. These metal wires resounded as if they were the strings of a musical instrument being played with a bow. The sledge sped along to the accompaniment of this plaintive harmony, which had an exceptional intensity about it. These chords are in fifths and octaves, said Mr. Fogg. These were the only words he uttered during the whole journey. Mrs. Aouda, who was carefully wrapped up in furs and travel rugs, was as far as possible protected from the effects of the cold. Passepartout, meanwhile, his face as red as the setting sun, seen through the mist, was breathing in the sharp air. With that unshakable confidence that was an essential part of his makeup, he had started to hope again. Instead of getting to New York in the morning, they would get there in the evening, but there was still a possibility that this would be before the steamer for Liverpool left. So as some of you might know, at the time, one of the direct routes to the UK via America was from New York to Liverpool. It was probably the most common route that they would use by ship, I should say. Passepartout had even felt a strong desire to shake hands with his ally, Fix. He hadn't forgotten that it was the inspector himself who had got hold of the sailing sledge, and therefore only possible means of reaching Omaha in time. But because of some strange premonition, he remained guarded towards Fix, as usual. In any case, there was one thing that Passepartout would never forget, and that was the sacrifice that Mr. Fogg had made, without hesitation, in rescuing him from the Sioux. In doing so, Mr. Fogg had risked his fortune and his life. No, his servant would never forget that. While these various thoughts occupied the minds of each traveler, the sledge was flying on across the immense carpet of snow. They hardly had time to notice that they went past the few creeks, tributaries, and sub-tributaries of the Little Blue River. The fields and... is my, oh dear. Gotta take care of this. Oh dear. Can't see the name. No, thank you. No, thank you. Ah, there we are. Where was I? Oh yeah, yeah. There we are. The fields and watercourses were covered by a uniform whiteness. Oh, thank you for the posture check, Julian 20. The fields and watercourses were covered by a uniform whiteness. The plain was absolutely deserted, covering the whole area between the Union Pacific Railroad and the branch line that is intended to link Kearney and St. Joseph. It formed what seemed a huge desert island. There was not a single village or station or even a fort. From time to time, a gruesome looking tree flashed by, its white skeleton twisting in the wind. Sometimes flocks of birds took flight all at the same time. Sometimes, too, large packs of prairie wolves, thin and hungry and driven on by some fearsome need, tried to outrun the sledge. At moments such as these, Passepartout, with his revolver in his hand, stood ready to fire at the animals that got nearest. If an accident of some sort had brought the sledge to a standstill at such times, the travelers would have been attacked by these fierce carnivores, and would have been in considerable danger. But the sledge stood the strain and soon raced ahead, leaving the whole pack howling behind it. By midday, Mudge recognized the telltale signs that he was following the frozen course of the Platte River. He didn't say anything, but he was already convinced that 20 miles further on he would reach the station at Omaha. And sure enough, less than an hour later, this skillful guide left the helm, rushed to the halyards, and lowered the sail while the sledge, carried along by its own momentum, traveled another half a mile with all its sails taken in. At last, it came to a standstill, and Mudge, pointing to a collection of snow-covered roofs, said, "We've arrived." They had indeed arrived at this station, which has frequent trains and a daily service to the east of the United States. I don't know why I'm kind of chuckling at this, but it just feels like Jules Verne is inadvertently acting as a advertisement for the Union Pacific. Passepartout and Fix had jumped out of the vehicle and were moving about to get their circulation back. They helped Mr. Fogg and Mrs. Iota to get out of the sledge. Phileas Fogg paid Mudge handsomely, and Passepartout shook his hand as if they had been old friends. And they all rushed off towards Omaha Station. This important city in Nebraska is where the Pacific Railroad, properly speaking, comes to an end, linking the Mississippi Basin to the ocean. To go from Omaha to Chicago, the railway, known as the Chicago Rock Island Railroad, runs directly east, serving 50 stations on the way. A direct train was about to leave. Phileas Fogg and his companions just had time to jump into a carriage. They hadn't seen anything of Omaha, but Passepartout admitted to himself that this was no cause for regret, because it wasn't the time for sightseeing. At great speed, the train crossed into the state of Iowa, via Council Bluffs, Des Moines, and Iowa City. During the night, it crossed the Mississippi at Davenport and entered Illinois via Rock Island. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the following day, the 10th, it reached Chicago, which had already risen again out of its ruins. Was this about that time? Hold on, I'm gonna look at this. I think there's a note in here. I want to be sure before I mention this. So this is chapter. Okay, so it is. So what this is referring to, my dear scholars, is referring to the Great Fire of 1871, which really burnt down a lot of Chicago at the time. I believe that was the fire that was blamed on a cow kicking over a lantern. Um, when was this book written? So this book was written in 1873, so 2 years after the fire had hit. So in a way, this was a quick thing. Private Matter, the Chicago Fire. Yes, the Chicago Fire of 1871. That's what they're referring to in this part of the book. I wanted to make sure before I mention that. It reached Chicago, which had already risen again out of its ruins, looking more impressive than ever in its position overlooking the beautiful Lake Michigan. There are 900 miles between Chicago and New York. There was no shortage of trains in Chicago. Mr. Fogg went straight from one train to another. The frisky locomotive of the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, Chicago Railroad set off at full speed, as if it was fully aware that the honorable gentleman had no time to lose. It was like lightning through Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, passing through towns with classical sounding names, some having streets and tram cars, but as yet no houses. At last the Hudson came into view, and on the 11th of December, at 11:15 in the evening, the train pulled up in the station, on the right bank of the river, just in front of the pier for the steamers of the Canoe Line, in other words, the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. The China, bound for Liverpool, had left 45 minutes earlier. Oh, that's one water down. Oh, gotta reach over. Oh, poor Fogg. He just has. He started off so well, and now he's having just the worst luck finding transport. This, ironically enough, would not be the last time that Jules Verne would set a novel in the Great Plains of the United States. Um, a later novel of his, which was called Master of the World, would be mainly set in the Great Lakes area of the United States, which I think that was written after Around the World in 80 Days, which shows that he did have some interest in that part of the world. Excuse me. Oh my goodness, my gracious. Pardon my little coughs there. But yes, it is interesting because again, he's writing for a French and European audience. So this would be oh yeah, you're right. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is set in the Great Plains. Sure. Blah blah. Also, welcome, blah blah. Good to see you. Horace has been waiting for you to show up. Oh, oh my goodness. But yeah, the blah blah gives Horace a high five. Oh, Horace enjoys those high fives. The 20. Yes. But yeah, you have to remember that he is writing for a Europe, mainly a French, mainly a European, mainly French audience. So for them at this time, descriptions of the Great Plains and the Great Lakes of the United States is a rather exciting thing. Excuse me. Again, pardon the coughs. Chapter 32, in which Phileas Fogg squares up to misfortune. The China's departure seemed to signal the end of all of Phileas Fogg's hopes. One second. Okay. I like to mark ahead where the next chapter is going to be. The China's departure seemed to signal the end of all Phileas Fogg's hopes. No other steamer plying the direct route from America to Europe could further the gentleman's plan. This applied to the French transatlantic steamers, the ships of the White Star Line, the steamers of the Inman Company, those of the Hamburg Line, and any others. In particular, the Perrier, belonging to the French Transatlantic Company, whose excellent ships were equal in speed and superior in comfort to those of every other line. I can guess why, Jules Verne. Didn't leave for another 2 days, 14th of December. In any case, like the ships of the Hamburg Line, it didn't go directly to Liverpool or London, but to Le Havre, and the additional crossing from Le Havre to Southampton would have caused Phileas Fogg further delay, thereby rendering his final efforts useless. Densuo, hello there, Densuo. Welcome. Glad to have you here. We are reading Around the World in 80 Days. Good to see you. It's been a while. As for the steamers of the Inman Company, one of them, the City of Paris, was sailing to sea the following day, but it was pointless even thinking about it. These ships were used mainly for the transport of emigrants, and so their engines lacked power. They used sail power as much as steam, and their speed was poor. With them, the crossing from New York to England took longer than the time that was left to Mr. Fogg if he was to win his bet. The gentleman was perfectly aware of all this from reading his Bradshaw, which gave him detailed information about ocean sailings across the globe for every day of the year. Passepartout felt completely devastated. To have missed the steamer by 45 minutes was a terrible blow for him. It was all his fault. Instead of helping his master, all he'd done was to keep putting obstacles in his way. And when he cast his mind back over all that had happened during the journey, when he worked out the sums of money spent for nothing and just on him, when he reflected that this huge bet, not to mention the considerable costs of this now pointless voyage, had completely ruined Mr. Fogg financially, he was furious with himself. Mr. Fogg, however, made no criticism of him, and as he left the pier for the transatlantic steamers, he merely said, "We shall decide what to do tomorrow. Come along." Mr. Fogg, Miss Iota, Fix, and Passepartout crossed the Hudson in the New Jersey City ferry, and then got into a cab which drove them to the St. Nicholas Hotel in Broadway. Rooms were found for them, and they spent the night there. It went quickly for Phileas Fogg, who slept soundly, but it went much more slowly for Miss Iota and her companions, whose minds were so agitated that they didn't get much rest. The next day was the 12th of December. From 7 o'clock in the morning on the 12th to a quarter to 9 in the evening on the 21st, there were 9 days, 13 hours, and 45 minutes remaining. So if Phileas Fogg had set off the previous day on the China, one of the fastest ships of the Cunard line, he would have arrived in Liverpool and then in London within the deadline. Excuse me. Mr. Fogg left the hotel alone, after having instructed his servant to wait for him and to inform Mrs. Iota that she should be ready to depart at any moment. Mr. Fogg went along to the banks of the Hudson, and among the ships moored along the quaysides or at anchor in the river, he searched out carefully those that were ready to sail. Several vessels had their departure flags flying and were ready to set to sea on the morning tide. Not a single day goes by in this enormous and magnificent port of New York without 100 ships setting out for destinations all over the world. But most of them were sailing ships and were not suitable for Mr. Fogg's purposes. The gentleman's final attempt seemed condemned to failure, when suddenly he saw moored in front of the battery no more than a cable's length away a propeller-driven commercial vessel, with elegant lines and with clouds of smoke coming out of its funnel, the sign that it was ready to sail, getting ready to sail. Phileas Fogg hauled a rowing boat, got in, and after a few strokes on the oars, had reached the ladder of the Henrietta, a steamer with an iron hull, with all its upper works made of wood. The captain of the Henrietta was on board. Phileas Fogg climbed on to the bridge and asked for him. He appeared immediately. He was a man of about 50, a sort of sea dog, a grumpy individual who certainly wouldn't be easy to deal with. He had bulging eyes, a rusty copper-colored complexion, red hair, and a neck like a bull's. There was nothing sophisticated about his appearance. "Are you the captain? Are you the captain?" asked Phileas Fogg.
That's me.
"I am Phileas Fogg, from London."
I am Andrew Speedy, from Cardiff.
"Are you about to leave?"
In an hour.
"Where are you making for?"
Bordeaux.
"What are you carrying?"
Stones in the belly. No freight. Leaving with ballast.
"Do you have any passengers?"
No passengers. Never take passengers. Too cumbersome. Too argumentative.
"Does your ship go well?"
11 to 12 knots. The Henrietta. Well known.
"Will you take me and 3 other people to Liverpool?"
To Liverpool? Why not China?
"I said Liverpool."
No.
"No."
No. I'm leaving for Bordeaux. And Bordeaux's where I'm going.
"At any price?"
At any price.
The captain had spoken and wasn't to be contradicted. "But the owners of the Henrietta," continued Phileas Fogg.
Then it's me, replied the captain. It's my ship.
"I'll charter it from you."
No.
"I'll buy it from you."
No.
Phileas Fogg didn't bat an eyelid. However, the situation was serious. New York wasn't the same thing as Hong Kong, and dealing with the captain of the Henrietta wasn't the same thing as dealing with the skipper of the Tankadere. So far, the gentleman's money had always been able to overcome obstacles. This time, money didn't work. Nevertheless, it was essential to find a way of crossing the Atlantic by boat, unless they could get across in a hot air balloon, which would have been very risky and in any case was not practical. I'll talk about that after this chapter is done, my dear scholars. It looked, however, as if Phileas Fogg had an idea, because he said to the captain, "Well then, will you take me to Bordeaux?"
No, not even if you paid me $200.
"I'm offering you $2,000.
Per person?
Per person."
And there are 4 of you.
4. Captain Speedy began to scratch his forehead, as if he was intent on tearing all the skin off of it. Earning 8,000 without changing his route made it worth putting aside his aversion to having passengers on board. In any case, passengers are at $2,000 a go are no longer passengers, but valuable cargo.
I'm leaving at 9 o'clock, he said briefly, and if you and yours are there...
By 9 o'clock we'll be on board, Phileas Fogg replied, just as briefly. It was 8:30. With the calm that never deserted him, whatever the circumstances, the gentleman got off the Henrietta, took a carriage, went to the St. Nicholas Hotel, and brought back Mrs. Iota, Passepartout, and the inseparable Fix, whose crossing he kindly offered to pay for. By the time the Henrietta set sail, the 4 of them were on board. When Passepartout discovered the cost of this latest crossing, he let out the sort of extended "oh" that goes through every interval on the descending chromatic scale. As for Inspector Fix, he thought to himself that the Bank of England was really going to come off badly from this business. The truth was that by the time they arrived, and even supposing that this fellow Fogg didn't throw a few more fistfuls of dollars overboard, there would still be more than £7,000 missing from the bag of banknotes. So, what I mentioned about the hot air balloon. Um, if you've seen the 1955 version of Around the World in 80 Days, and I think in some of the other versions Around the World in 80 Days, in that one, Phileas Fogg does use a hot air balloon. As you notice with this chapter, though, Fogg turns down the very idea as being impractical and not very useful for their journey. If you think about it, the reasoning is this. Um, Traveling by hot air balloon is all well and good. But in some ways, once you're in the air in a hot air balloon, you really are more or less at the mercy of the winds. You can navigate somewhat, but if anything goes wrong, there's not much you can do to change your course. So the idea of trying to cross the Atlantic, which I think at that point was crossed by hot air balloon at one point, crossing the Atlantic by hot air balloon with this bet, it would have been an utter disaster. There would be the chance the wind would change, that the wind would slacken, that he wouldn't be able to control himself, wouldn't be able to control the balloon across the Atlantic, that something might go wrong and he crashed in the ocean. So doing that, it really is kind of a foolish plan to do so. The movies tend to ignore that for the sake of, well, it's cool to see someone flying in a hot air balloon. Funny enough, in the 1955 version, they actually do show that flying in a hot air balloon ends up costing um, Fogg part of his journey. In that version, they take the hot air balloon from France with the plan to take it from France to another part of France where they can take a ship onward. The problem is, in the movie, they end up in Spain instead of France using the hot air balloon. Um, which again shows that traveling by such means when you're in a hurry is not usually the smartest move to take. Okay, my dear scholars, this next chapter is going to be the last one for the night. Um, since we want to save the last four chapters, since some of them are quite short, for next stream. So are you all ready, my dear scholars, for this last chapter for now? Pardon my drink. Well, I suppose we are. Chapter 33, where Phileas Fogg proves himself equal to the situation. An hour later, the steamer, the Henrietta, passed the lightship marking the mouth of the Hudson, went around the headland of Sandy Hook, and put out to sea. During the day it followed the coastline of Long Island, keeping well clear of the beacon on Fire Island, then headed rapidly eastwards. At midday on the following day, 13th of December, a man climbed onto the bridge to take the ship's bearings. It would seem safe to assume that this man was Captain Speedy. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was Phileas Fogg, Esquire. Excuse me.
Captain Speedy, meanwhile, was quite simply locked up in his cabin, and was howling away, giving vent to a quite understandable anger that was reaching fever pitch. What had happened was perfectly simple. Phileas Fogg wanted to get to Liverpool, but the captain didn't want to take him there. Phileas Fogg had then agreed to travel to Bordeaux, and during the 30 hours he'd been on board, had put his banknotes to work so effectively, that the crew, the sailors, and the stokers, a motley collection of individuals who were on pretty bad terms with the captain, had been won over. This is why Phileas Fogg was in command instead of Captain Speedy, why the captain was locked up in his cabin, and lastly why the Henrietta was heading for Liverpool. It was, though very clear from the way he set about things, that Mr. Fogg had been a sailor. Oh, hello there, Kay Monreal. Welcome. Bought himself a mutiny. Yes, he basically bribed every single sailor on the ship to mutiny against the captain. Oh my goodness. I mean, technically, what Fogg is doing is breaking maritime law, but it is a private venture, and he essentially is. He's essentially bought the ship underneath the captain. It was too early to tell how things would work out. However, Mrs. Aouda was worried without letting it show. Fix had been simply dumbfounded to start with. As for Passepartout, he found the whole thing absolutely wonderful. "Between 11 and 12 knots," was what Captain Speedy had said, and sure enough, the Henrietta kept up with this average speed. And so but there were a lot of ifs, the sea didn't get too rough, if the wind didn't veer to the east, if the vessel was spared accidental damage and mechanical breakdown, it was possible for the Henrietta to cover the 3,000 miles separating New York and Liverpool in the 9 days between 12 and 21st of December. It is true that once he arrived, the business of the Henrietta coming on top of the business at the Bank of England could well cause the gentleman more complications than he liked. For the first few days, conditions for sailing were excellent. The sea wasn't too difficult. The wind seemed settled in the northeast. The sails were set, and under its trysails the Henrietta went like a real transatlantic steamer. Passepartout was delighted. He was full of enthusiasm for his master's latest exploit, though he didn't want to think about its consequences. The crew had never seen such a high-spirited and nimble fellow. He was very friendly toward the sailors, and amazed them with his acrobatics. He treated them to compliments and tempting-looking drinks. For him, they went about their work like gentlemen, and the stokers stoked like heroes. Everyone was susceptible to his infectious good humor. He'd forgotten about the recent past, the problems and the dangers. The only thing he thought about was the goal, that they were so close to reaching, and sometimes he was boiling over with impatience, as if he'd been heated up by the Henrietta's own furnace. The worthy fellow often circled around Fix, looking at him knowingly, but not saying a word, because there was no longer any closeness between the two former friends. In any case, it has to be said that Fix no longer had a clue about what was going on. This whole sequence of events, the takeover of the Henrietta, the bribing of the crew, and Fogg navigating like an experienced sailor, had him baffled. He just didn't know what to think. But after all, a gentleman who started out by stealing £55,000 could easily end up stealing a sailing ship. And Fix naturally went on to conclude that under Phileas Fogg's command, the Henrietta was not heading for Liverpool at all, but for some other part of the world where the thief, who had now turned into a pirate, could safely spend the rest of his life. Oh my goodness, Fix, get off yourself, please. You've been wrong for every single theory. What makes you think you're going to be right about this? It has to be admitted that this was a perfectly plausible explanation, and the detective was beginning seriously to regret ever having got caught up in this business. Meanwhile, Captain Speedy continued to howl away in his cabin, and Passepartout, who had been given the task of providing him with food, only did so with the greatest of caution, despite his own physical strength. Mr. Fogg, on the other hand, no longer seemed to suspect there was a captain on board. On the 13th, they reached the tail end of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. These are dangerous waters, especially during the winter. Fog is common and the storms are frightening. The previous day the barometer had dropped suddenly, a sign that a change in the weather was imminent. And sure enough, during the night the temperature changed, the cold became more intense, and at the same time the wind veered to the southeast. It was a setback. In order to stick to his route, Mr. Fogg had to take in the sails and increase the steam. Nevertheless, the ship's progress was slowed down by the state of the sea, with high waves breaking against its stern. The ship began to pitch violently, and this further affected its speed. The wind was gradually reaching hurricane force, and it already looked as if the Henrietta might not be able to face the waves full on. But if it had to run before the storm, that would be a leap into the unknown, with all the dangers that this entailed. Passpartout's face became as dark as the sky, and for 2 days the worthy fellow was on tether hooks. But Phileas Fogg was a bold sailor who knew how to stand up to the sea, and he kept straight on, without even reducing steam. When the Henrietta couldn't rise above the waves, it went straight through them, and although the deck was swamped, the ship carried on. Sometimes, too, the propeller was lifted clean out of the water, and the blades whirred madly in the air as a mountainous wave raised the stern. But still the ship continued on its course. Nevertheless, the wind didn't freshen as much as might have been feared. It wasn't one of those hurricanes that reached speeds of up to 90 miles per hour. The wind didn't go beyond gale force. But unfortunately, it kept on blowing through the southeast and made it impossible to put the sails out. However, as will soon become apparent, the wind would have been very useful for helping out the steam power. More water. The 16th of December was the 75th day since they had left London. In a word, the delay to the Henrietta was still not serious. Half the crossing had almost been completed, and the most difficult waters were already behind them. If it had been summer, success would have been guaranteed. As it was winter, they were at the mercy of bad weather. Passepartout didn't make his views known. Deep down he was hopeful, and if the wind failed, he was counting on steam to get them there. As it happened, on that particular day, the engineer went on deck, met Mr. Fogg, and had quite a sharp conversation with him. Without knowing why, no doubt by a premonition, Passepartout felt a vague sort of uneasiness. He would have given his right arm to hear what was being said. However, he did manage to catch a few words, including the following spoken by his master.
Are you sure that what you're saying is true?
Absolutely certain, sir, replied the engineer. Don't forget that since we set out we've been going full blast, and even if we had enough coal to go at low steam from New York to Bordeaux, we don't have enough to go at full steam from New York to Liverpool.
I shall decide what to do, replied Mr. Fogg. Passepartout had understood. He suddenly became extremely worried. They were going to run out of coal.
Oh, if my master can get us out of this one, he said to himself, then he really is somebody.
After bumping into Fix, he couldn't help telling him about the situation.
So,
The inspector replied, gritting his teeth.
you really think that we're heading for Liverpool? But of course. Idiot!
Answered the inspector as he walked away, shrugging his shoulders. Passepartout was about to take strong exceptions to this word, even if he wasn't in a position to understand its full significance. But he said to himself that poor old Fix must be very disappointed, and his pride must have taken a battering at the idea of having gone around the world on a wild goose chase. And so Passepartout let the remark pass. So what would Phileas Fogg's decision be? It was hard to imagine. However, the Flemish gentleman seemed to have made up his mind, because that very evening he sent for the engineer and said to him, "Stoke up the boilers and go full steam ahead until there's no fuel left." A few moments later, the Henrietta's funnel was belching out clouds of smoke. So the ship continued on course at full steam. But just as he had warned, 2 days later, the 18th, the engineer announced that they would run out of coal during that day. Don't let the fires die down," replied Mr. Fogg. "On the contrary, keep up the pressure in the engine." That day, at about midday, after taking a bearing to calculate the ship's position, Phileas Fogg sent for Passepartout and told him to go and fetch Captain Speedy. It was like telling the good fellow to go and unleash a tiger, but he went down to the poop deck saying to himself,
"He's going to go absolutely berserk."
A few minutes later, amid shouting and swearing, a bomb duly landed on the poop deck. You? That bomb was Captain Speedy. It was obvious that he was about to explode.
"Where are we?"
was the first word he uttered, choking with anger, and it was clear that if this worthy fellow had had a weak heart, he would never have survived.
"Where are we?"
he repeated, red in the face. 770 miles east of Liverpool, replied Mr. Fogg with total composure.
"Pirate!"
exclaimed Andrew Speedy. "I sent for you, sir."
"Sea rover!"
"Sir," continued Mr. Fogg, "to ask you to sell me your ship."
"No! Like hell no!"
"The fact is, I'm going to have to burn it."
"Burn my ship?"
"Yes, at least the upper works, because we're running out of fuel."
"Burn my ship!"
exclaimed Captain Speedy, who had difficulty getting the words out of his mouth any more.
"A ship worth £50,000, $50,000."
"Here's $60,000, replied Phileas Fogg, handing the captain a wad of banknotes. The effect on Andrew Speedy was spectacular. No true American can fail to be moved by the sight of $60,000. For a moment the captain forgot about his anger, his imprisonment, and all his grievances against his passenger. His ship was 20 years old. This deal was worth a packet. The bomb was no longer going to explode. Mr. Fogg had removed the fuse. "But I'll still have the iron hull left," he said, sounding remarkably calmer. "The iron hull and the machinery, sir. Are we agreed?"
"Agreed."
With that, Andrew Speedy grabbed the wad of banknotes, counted them, and stashed them away in his pocket. During this scene, Passepartout was white as a sheet. Fix, for his part, almost had a heart attack. Nearly £20,000 had already been spent, and now here was Fogg giving away to the vendor the hull and the machinery, in other words, almost half the total value of the ship. It was just as well that the amount of money stolen from the bank was £55,000. When Andrew Speedy had put all the money away in his pocket, Mr. Fogg said to him, "Sir, let me explain something to you. If I am not back in London by 8:45 in the evening on the 21st of December, I will lose £20,000. The fact is that I missed the steamer from New York, and because you refused to take me to Liverpool—"
"And I did the right thing there. I'll swear that by the devil," exclaimed Andrew Speedy, "because I've made at least $40,000.
Then he added, rather more calmly,
"Do you know something, Captain
Fogg."
Captain Fogg? Well, there's a bit of the Yankee about you."
And after giving his passenger what he thought was a compliment, he was about to go when Mr. Fogg said to him, "So this boat belongs to me now, doesn't it?"
"Well, from the keel to the hull, top of the masts, everything made of wood, that is."
"Good. Take out all internal fittings and use them as firewood." It is easy to imagine how much dry wood needs to be burnt to keep the steam up to sufficient pressure. That day, the poop deck, the deck houses, the cabins, the crew's quarters, and the spar deck all went. The following day, 19th of December, they burnt the masting, the spare masts and yards, and the spars. They chopped down the masts and cut them up with axes. The crew set about their task with incredible energy. Passepartout was slicing, cutting, and sawing away, doing the work of 10 men. It was an orgy of destruction. The day after, 20th December, the rails, the bulwarks, the deadworks, and most of the decks were fed to the flames. The Henrietta was now so low it looked like a pontoon, not a ship. But that day they sighted the coast of Ireland and the Fastnet lighthouse. More water, so much water for this one. However, by 10 o'clock in the evening, the ship was still off Queenstown. Phileas Fogg only had 24 hours left to get to London. That was precisely how long it would take the Henrietta to get to Liverpool, even if it went by full steam. And steam was just what the daring gentleman was running out of.
"Sir,"
Captain Speedy said to him, as he had now come round to showing an interest in his plans,
"I feel really sorry for you. Everything's against you. We're still no further than Queenstown."
"Ah," said Mr. Fogg, "is that the town we can see, where the lights are coming from?"
"Yes."
"Can we enter the harbour?"
"Not for another 3 hours, only at high tide."
"Let's wait, then," Phileas Fogg replied calmly, without letting it show on his face that he was about to attempt once again to overcome his bad luck by another masterstroke. Queenstown is, as it happens, a port on the Irish coast, where transatlantic liners from the United States drop off their mail bags. These letters are taken to Dublin by express trains that are always ready and waiting. From Dublin, they go to Liverpool via high-speed steamers, cutting 12 hours off the time taken by the fastest vessels of the shipping companies. Excuse me. Phileas Fogg thought that he, too, could make up 12 hours, as the mail from America did. Instead of arriving in Liverpool on the Henrietta the following evening, he would get there by midday, which would allow him time to get to London by 8:45 in the evening. Towards 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Henrietta entered Queenstown Harbor on the full tide, and Phileas Fogg, after receiving a vigorous handshake from Captain Speedy, left the latter on the flattened carcass of his ship, which was still worth half what he had got for selling it. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. I am sorry, my dear scholars. There is so much dry air going on here in the study. The passengers disembarked immediately. Fix at that moment felt a great urge to arrest Fogg. He refrained from doing so, however. Why? What struggle was going on inside him? Had he changed his mind about Mr. Fogg? Did he realize at last that he had been wrong? Nevertheless, Fogg did not let go of Mr. Fogg. Along with him, Mrs. Aouda and Passepartout, who was in such a rush he didn't pause for breath. He got into the train from Queenstown at 1:30 in the morning, reached Dublin as dawn was breaking, and immediately got on to one of those steamers, real steel rockets that are all engine, which do not bother to rise with the waves but inevitably go straight through them. At 20 minutes to midday on 21st of December, Phileas Fogg at last landed at Liverpool docks. He was only 6 hours away from London. But at that moment, Fix went up to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and showing him his warrant, said, "You are Phileas Fogg, are you not?" "Yes, sir." "In the name of Her Majesty the Queen, I arrest you." And we're going to stop there, my dear scholars, for the night. Oh, my dear, oh, poor Fogg. And oh, that's idiotic Fix. Oh, so close. Oh, Yulian 20 is such a good story. Oh, it is. So, the crossing with the Henrietta in the movie is a little different than it is in the book. Fogg has a good relationship with the captain in the movie. They don't have any problems. In fact, Fogg paid off the captain and the crew early on. They do dismantle the ship, and Fogg buys the ship from the captain. The they do dismantle it one by one by one, but it does go fairly cleanly. The the end result is practically what we see in the book, though. So poor Fogg has now been arrested. So we have to wonder next time, how is he going to get out of this? We have 4 chapters left, my dear scholars, of this book. So next week, if everything goes according to plan and nothing goes wrong, we'll be on Tuesday. We'll be doing more Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. And next Thursday again, if everything goes according to plan, we'll be finishing off Around the World in 80 days. Oh, it's been quite a ride, my dear scholars. Quite a ride. So for now, let's see if there is anyone we can raid for the night. Oh, and look, it's already 1 hour and 30. It was perfect timing. Okay, let's see. this is a. Should we raid a gaming streamer or a reading streamer, my dear scholars? I almost feel like we should raid. I don't know. Kintron, 4 chapters, all of which should be the final day. Nice. Yes. Let's see who's. Is there any readers right now? I think you're okay with either. So we got one for reading, one for either. You know, we haven't raided Jewelry Jelly in a while. Let's raid Jewelry Jelly for the evening. It's been a while since we raided her. Good friend of the, a very good friend of the study. So, my dear scholars, I say unto you, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, till we meet each other again at the study. Take care, and I shall see you next time. Till then, farewell and bye bye.